Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining eTitle for today's webinar, Closing and Insuring Cannabis Transactions. My name is Connie Kinzer. It is my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speakers for today, Brian Henry and Timothy Ryan. Brian Henry is the Senior Director of eTitle. He provides strategic direction and counsel for title services and products that are provided in 16 jurisdictions, including Michigan, Florida, and along the East Coast. Mr. Henry has over 40 years experience in supervising sale and refinance transactions and providing advice to commercial and residential developers. He is a past chair of the Real Property Law section and is a member of the Zoning Board of Appeals for Bloomfield Township, the Michigan Electronic Recording Commission, and the Michigan Land Title Standards Committee. Brian has lectured on a variety of real estate subjects and taught business law at the University of Phoenix, Michigan campus. Timothy Ryan is a commercial title attorney for eTitle. Tim serves clients in his role as commercial title attorney for eTitle agency in the Troy, Michigan office. He has led the cannabis closing team for over 3 years. In that time, Timothy has closed over 75 cannabis transactions, including cash sales, land contracts, mortgages, construction mortgages, and mortgage refinances. As a leader of the cannabis closing team, Timothy has closed commercial transactions in across the state as well as other jurisdictions ranging in value from $100,000 to well over $16 million. He maintains close relationships with company underwriters to work through even the most complex title issues. Timothy is a member of the Real Property Law section as well as the Marijuana Law section. I now turn it over to Brian and Tim.
Connie, thanks so much. Let's get started. We're going to go over 4 areas today, states where cannabis is legal, both recreational use and medical, the volume of business done in key states, important federal bills that have been introduced, and Tim's going to cover how cannabis closings are different from traditional commercial closings. Here's a map of where adult and medical use is permitted and also recreational use. The dark green is recreational. You can see it's largely concentrated on the West Coast. You have Michigan and Illinois in the middle, and then some states on the upper northeast coast. And then the dark green are those states where medical cannabis programs are legal. Here's the list of states, both adult and medical use are permitted in 36 states. And you can see the spread is fairly comprehensive. Interesting, in 2021, Connecticut, New Mexico, New York, and Virginia all passed laws making recreational use legal. Virginia actually moved up the date for legalization. Each of these states has a date for legalization and then a date when sales can be legal. The difference for that is the licensing portion of the legislation. Often it'll take some time for licenses to be issued before sales will start. You're going to see a slide later that talks about the growth in the cannabis industry nationwide. It's about a $61 billion industry, and it's projected to be $100 billion by 2030. In 2020, nationwide cannabis sales increased 67%. So you've seen a lot of interest in the cannabis industry because of that growth. And here's the projections. Not everyone's in complete agreement with this growth, but everyone does agree that the cannabis revenues will only increase as more and more states adopt laws and as more and more businesses become comfortable with the legality. Here's some key markets. The states that are on this slide: California, Colorado, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington State were all early adopters. California, it's about a $4 billion industry. Colorado, $2 billion. And Oregon about $1 billion. So you can see these are significant revenue generating businesses, and they're rapidly growing. For example, in Illinois, recreational sales started in January of 2020, topped $1 billion by December. And this year, sales in Illinois topped $1 billion by the start of September. The Michigan market. 20% of Michigan's municipalities have elected in, so 80% have elected to prohibit recreational marijuana sales. So what that means is, in Michigan, a community must opt in and pass an ordinance permitting recreational sales. Michigan still sees a lot of growth, despite the fact that 80% of the municipalities have elected to prohibit recreational sales. So in 2021, monthly recreational sales exceeded 100 million per month in April, and have continued to exceed 100 million per month, and are on pace to reach 1.2 billion by the end of the year, which is double the level of sales in 2020. In 2021, it's projected that recreational and medical sales will exceed 2 billion. And in 2022, it's projected that recreational sales alone will reach 1.7 billion, so a $500 million increase over 2021, and then will increase at the same rate in 2023 to reach 2.2 billion. Here's a map showing those communities that have opted in. The blue dots are recreational use. The green are medical. You can see it's fairly well dispersed, both Upper Peninsula and Lower Peninsula. These are the communities that have opted in. I'm not going to read all of them. I'll just go through the slides. You can see it's quite a disbursement. Here's more. I just note here that Ingham County has Lansing, East Lansing, and Lansing Charter Township. Here we have Macomb County with a few that have opted in, Kalamazoo and Jackson on the west side of the state. Here, Oakland County, you can see there's Hazel Park, Bald Lake, Ferndale that have opted in. And here in Wayne and Washtenaw counties, some fairly significant population areas, Detroit and Ann Arbor, have both opted in. It's important to know that when a community opts in, there are common characteristics to the enabling ordinance. Typically, a provisioning center cannot be located within 400 feet of a school, public playground, public park, outdoor recreation area, or a public library. And similarly, a provisioning center cannot be located within 200 feet of a religious institution or a residentially zoned property. So most of the communities that I showed you have an ordinance that have those type of restrictions. Federal legislation. The Safe Banking Act, the Secure and Fair Enforcement Banking Act, allows banks to provide financial services to cannabis-related legitimate businesses. However, this bill has never made it to the Senate floor for a vote. It's still waiting for a Senate vote or discussion. I'm going to show you a couple other bills that are being considered that probably have slowed down a vote of the Senate because there isn't consensus on which bill should be passed. So two other bills that address marijuana at the federal level are the MORE bill, which is the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act. That would decriminalize it. It would remove cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act. And in July, the Cannabis Administration Opportunity Act was introduced by Senators Schumer, Booker, and Wyden. This is really the most comprehensive bill that's been introduced. It removes marijuana and THC from the Controlled Substances Act, transfers agency jurisdiction over cannabis from the DEA to the FDA, and allows movement of cannabis products through channels of interstate commerce, regardless of whether the channels are located in a state where cannabis is legal. So there's a lot of interest in this bill because of its comprehensive nature. It decriminalizes it, allows movement of cannabis products across state lines, and also transfer jurisdiction over cannabis to a new federal agency. So it'll be interesting to see which of these three bills the Senate elects to pick up, discuss, and pass. And there are competing bills now over infrastructure and the budget that seem to be taking attention away from these and directing them towards those other priorities. Lending sources for cannabis businesses, as Tim will cover, more and more lending institutions are becoming comfortable with lending to cannabis businesses. When we first started in this area 3 years ago, almost all transactions were cash. We've seen state chartered credit unions become interested in it, looking at accepting deposits from cannabis businesses and lending. And now we're even seeing some federally chartered institutions test the waters to see if both lending and accepting deposits make sense for them. I'll turn it over to Tim now to cover the 4 areas that he wants to discuss regarding how a cannabis transaction is different from a typical commercial closing.
Thank you. And as Brian mentioned, I want to focus on what is different in a cannabis transaction as opposed to a conventional commercial closing. Today, I'll be discussing 4 areas: financing the transaction, the title policy, closing the transaction, and desired locations. Each of these areas has issues that are unique to cannabis, so let's get started. Financing the transaction. As you know, and as Brian has covered, there are not many FDIC banks that are lending. We routinely work with one in the state of Michigan. It's very small, and they've made a decision to get into it. I've heard of another 1 or 2, but we really haven't worked with them. Current credit unions are lending a bit more than banks, but not to a great extent. We have dealt with a handful of credit unions, and I've heard from closings that a lot more credit unions are handling funds, but not necessarily lending. There are private lenders. We're seeing a lot of private lenders from all over the country, mainly from Colorado, California, New York, and Illinois. But we do get some from other areas as well. An interesting fact is one of the most common requests I get for an endorsement from private lenders is the usury endorsement. I've seen interest rates as high as 27%. This was a couple years ago, but the interest rates are relatively still high today. I work with several local mortgage brokers. They've been a great source of business. I don't see many large private lenders locally. Most local lenders I see are relatives lending to a family member. Mortgage deals range from the low of about $150,000 up to $16.5 million. We're seeing a resurgence of land contracts and the closings, and the issues that go along with those closings. We're seeing a lot of cash deals. Oftentimes those deals turn around and the purchaser will become a borrower and they'll get a construction loan right after closing. When we first started insuring these transactions, I had to routinely remind people not to bring cash to a closing. We had one closing before many banking institutions were allowing deposits. A buyer insisted he was going to bring $800,000 in cash to the closing. Luckily now it's not as much of a concern because banks are accepting deposits. Looking at the policy, it must be on Westcor Land Title Insurance Company. Westcourt is one of the largest national underwriters. Last time I saw the rankings, they were 4th or 5th nationally. They are continually growing, and their growth outpaces the other national underwriters. Westcourt does business across all lines of title, and cannabis is only a small portion of their business. There's another smaller national underwriter who will allow cannabis transactions, but I'm not familiar with their requirements as I'm not an agent for them. What types of policy are available? We offer through Westcourt, of course, owner's policies, lender's policy, and a construction loan policy. eTitle offers draw review in-house. If you're a developer and you work with the big underwriters, you know most underwriters will not allow their agents to review in-house, but require construction draws to be reviewed by their counsel, which adds delays. eTitle can turn around a draw request a lot faster than the underwriters. If you've reviewed a title commitment in the past 5 years, you will probably be familiar with the limitation language that appears on your screen. I've added emphasis to the part that states the company is not able to close or insure the transaction. This language appears somewhere on most underwriters' title commitments. Sometimes the parties will try to ignore that and close a transaction and think they have pulled one over, but ultimately, if there were a title claim, I think the underwriter would have a strong argument to deny liability. So why take the risk when Westcourt does not contain that language? Westcourt's language, like I said, doesn't include the limitation language. Instead, the title commitment will state that it does not insure for a particular use. The language on your screen is the standard language that appears on all Westcourt title commitments, and I've added some emphasis at the very bottom. So endorsements. Endorsements are on a case-by-case basis. As with all transactions, certain endorsements might not apply. Because this is marijuana, the underwriter wants to review and approve all endorsements. The only endorsement that is denied routinely is the zoning endorsement, or any endorsement really that is intended to insure for a particular use. Closing protection letters are not available for cannabis transactions. Most lenders are understanding because of the nature of the business. The most pushback is usually from lenders counsel. We can offer alternatives that most lenders will be comfortable with and accept a letter of good standing coupled with a policy authentication endorsement, which is an endorsement that we usually see being issued for the lack of a physical signature on a title policy or an endorsement. But in this case, we can also rely on the fact that it states that when all of the conditions are met, so when the lender sends their funding, the underwriter is obligated to issue that policy. There is a hard cap on the size of the transactions. We don't see too many of these, but when we do, we have been able to restructure the deal. Instead of the conveyance being in one transaction, we were lucky that the property contained several parcels, and we were able to restructure it as 2 conveyances, which allocated enough of the purchase price to the second deal and bring that main transaction under that cap. As far as your closing, Westcourt has numerous agents in the state of Michigan and across the nation, but only a few agents have decided to write policies for cannabis. Even fewer agents will prepare closing packages and close the transaction. Most agents will not handle the funds. eTitle will prepare closing documents, close the transaction, and insure. We've set up a separate escrow company to handle funds, so no more bringing literal cash to the table. Common pitfalls that can delay or even cancel a closing. From the very get-go, know the transaction and disclose the nature up front. I have seen so many transactions come to me because the agent has found out at the last minute the nature of your file. We can't pick up where they left off. We have to perform our own due diligence and start from the very beginning. Environmental reports. I've seen environmental reports kill a deal when an inexperienced attorney sees the report and thinks it's insurmountable. Ongoing construction. Most players in the cannabis field are not developers or even business people in general, and they don't keep the best records. If there has been construction within the last 90 days, we're going to want to review the sworn statement and waivers, or else the mechanics lien coverage is going to be unavailable and will remain as an exception on the policy. The parties themselves are sometimes inexperienced with sophisticated commercial transactions. They might not know they need their LLC documents, or they might not have even filed them with the state. I've gotten a lot of pushback because the parties are exhausted from dealing with the states and they're just tired of being asked questions. I promise my questions are limited to 5 or 6 and they're very casual questions. The last area that I want to talk about is good timing, desired locations, and solid planning. I want to bring up 3 examples that I've seen because there has to be some reward for the risks. Right around the time recreational use was enacted here in Michigan, about the beginning of October, we closed on a dilapidated residential rental property. It sold for about $40,000 more than it should have as a residential rental. And it sold at that price really on a wing and a prayer that maybe recreational would pass. Like I said, so we closed it in October. In November, days after the vote was counted and recreational had passed, the guy that just bought the property emailed me, and I thought he was probably following up on an item from closing. Instead, he sent me a new purchase agreement, and the new sale price was double what he had just paid. A small locally owned business, the owners bought their property several years before medical marijuana was even discussed. Their city had recently opted in for recreational businesses. And like all cities, their city has a zone where cannabis businesses could operate and where they couldn't. Can't be located within a certain distance of churches, schools, parks, etc. Their property just happened to be right outside of the exclusion zone. Their neighbor 200 feet away was not allowed to operate a cannabis business, but their property could. They had developers and realtors approaching them out of the blue and offering significantly more than what they had paid. All said and done, they will make probably 6 or 7 times what they paid just a few years before. And last, a large industrial building. A buyer had a plan. He'd bought a huge building, bigger than what he needed. He turned a portion of it into his grow and processing facility, and he planned to lease out the remaining space to other operations. In 2019, he bought a large building with a mortgage for about $1.5 million. In 2020, that buyer decided he was going to create a new a new company, which he did. And he led that company. He invited investors in, and he sold the property to the new company for $4.5 million. That investment company has since sold the property to a landlord for $17 million. And the original purchaser has leased back his space. He had a great plan. Not only did he set up the grow facility for himself, but other tenants as he reaped the rewards. So to recap, the financing will not be typical of a commercial closing. The policy will be the same, but is not excluding cannabis. You won't be able to get the zoning endorsement. Most title agents will not close or handle the funds. E-Title can do both. And the rewards, like I said, can be pretty significant. Thank you for your time today. If you have any questions, please feel free to email Brian or me. Our email addresses are appearing on your screen now.
Thank you, Brian and Tim. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. We hope you have a great day.